This video is going to be a storytime video only. There will be no sawdust or metal chips created during it, but I do have clips and photos from the project I'm going to talk about that I'll mix in throughout. It's been about 1 year now. We're coming up on the anniversary of one of my biggest flops, my biggest failed projects to date. And I'll tease it here a little bit with a mathematical operation. That's right. The net result, basically, of this project was $1,500 for 1,200 hours. And that comes out to $1.25 an hour, which is not that great. Could have been a whole lot better. It would have been really nice to shift the decimal point. So when I say a failed project, what I mean by that is one that didn't meet the goal that we were going for at the beginning. Okay, I don't mean a project that's one where you look back and say, that was a complete waste of time, I wish I hadn't done it. They may be synonymous. In this case, they're not. I learned a lot of things from it. Once you get to that point where you're not learning anymore, that's where you need to stop. And I didn't go too far past that point, so it was okay. The motivation for this project is pretty simple. I've always enjoyed building things ever since I was very small, probably before I could walk even. When I got involved with it at a more professional level after going to college, I found out that it was mainly sitting on the computer and sitting in meetings, and it just wasn't that much fun. So I ended up bailing on the professional end of things and going on my own, doing carpentry, remodeling, things like that. But the problem with that type of work is that you kind of hit a ceiling where you're going as fast as you can go on your own, because you have to drive places, you have to pick up materials, and even if you become faster at building, that's only part of it. You have to sell the project, you have to meet with people, run down dead ends. It becomes very time consuming, and you get better at it, you get better at screening who's serious about a project, but it gets difficult to go much faster than that. So you really need to get to the point where you're hiring other people, you're building a serious work trailer with all sorts of things in it. You have to commit to that. You can't just dabble in it, you need to go for it. And I wasn't ready to go for it. I didn't enjoy it enough to do it full-time like that, or full-time long-term. So I'm always on the lookout for other things. There's someone that I'd gone to high school with that I had a chance encounter with, and what they had sort of stumbled across this thing where people were making mass market or mass production maps in China out of wood of lakes. They look similar to this, except that they're not as good a quality. And so it's a depth map of a lake, and what they would do is simply take one sheet of plywood and cut it out and then step them down and kind of tack hot glue on the sides, which wasn't that great, so they had to have them in cases of glass so you couldn't touch it, things like that. Anyway, people had made these and sold these for a while. They seemed fairly expensive, and someone had requested him to make some of these maps out of plywood. And so he had made a few of those. We live in an area with a lot of lakes, and he thought that maybe this was an opportunity, maybe it was something we could work on together, so we decided to team up. The logic behind these maps is pretty simple as far as it being a successful product. It's not one of these things where it's like step one, do stuff, step two, step three, profit, okay? You start off and you have people who live on lakes. They identify emotionally with the lake. They spend money on the lake. They buy memorabilia, things like that. They spend a lot of money on their boats. It seems like there's a ready market for something which is customized to your lake. And the thing about the map too is it's super obvious who the immediate market is. They all live there, so it's easy to target them. It's easy to figure out who to talk to about Lake XYZ. It's all the people who live on it. So this was continuing for a while. We were making some maps. It was going okay at best, but it was also during the winter, so it's like February, March. Not a lot of people are out on the lake unless they're ice fishing, which is not nearly as popular. So you expected sales to be a little bit slow. The whole team thing was going okay to not that great. And if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. So I'll just say that it turned into a solo operation, which wasn't that fun. You find yourself locked out of the site, things like that. Anyway, I continued on my own, and the reason that I continued, even though I didn't have a laser cutter and things like that, was because it just felt like we hadn't really given it a serious shot yet. It wasn't even summer yet. And we've put all this work in, I've designed these maps, I've learned how to use CorelDRAW and these other things in the laser cutter. Let's give it a shot, right? If you give it a shot and it fails, then you say, well, there we go, that's done, I learned a lot of things. Whereas if you just give up, you haven't learned anything. So I wanted to give it a shot, and that's why I kept doing it. I have a pretty good selection of tools around here as far as woodworking tools and general things like that, but I don't have a laser cutter, as I mentioned, and a laser cutter is pretty critical because that's how you cut out the maps. I ended up going to a maker type place, which is south of here, about 40 minutes. So this is a good time though to talk about how a map is made. And the way that you start out is someone says they want this lake, or you think someone will want a lake. And I would go on to a lot of state websites, a lot of state fish and game, or in Michigan we call it the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, will have fishing maps. So you would take that data and I pull it into CorelDRAW, which is a vector drawing program. So we have to take the images, which are what the maps are, and then trace over them with the vector program. And that tracing, incidentally, sounds very simple. Oh, well, we'll just pull in some data and trace it, right? Well, these maps are not all the same. Some of them are a little blurry, some of them are a little sideways when they scanned them in. I expended a lot of effort trying to scale up that tracing, because I tried every flavor of tracing that I could find in CorelDRAW and they just weren't that great. And you just end up with the net effort being easier to go in and trace it yourself, to get really fast with the hotkeys. Once you get it in and it's in there, then you need to add roads maybe, you have some points of interest. It's not a matter of simply tracing these, they have to be cut out on different layers. But sorting it is, again, not necessarily that simple, because you can't just sort them down. What about spots like this, where they come up? Okay, and when they come up, how do you know where to put this thing? You need to take the outline of this one, engrave it down below just a little bit, so that you know where to put it. But you probably want it to be a little bit smaller so that you can't see it. This one you can actually see it a little bit. You would have a standard map file like this that has maybe 10 different layers on it at least. And all of that is time consuming. And if you're not able to make the same map more than once, it burns up a lot of time. Now we need to burn it with the laser cutter. So we take the laser cutter and we take our plywood. We had 2 thicknesses of plywood. The top was always 1/4 inch because it had a nicer face on it. If it only had a couple layers, we just use 1/4 for all of them so that it was thicker. If it had more layers, we would use this, which is 1/8 inch material. But you keep them flat, you get them in the laser, and then you have to do it. And as I said on the top layer, if you want a raster to engrave, you have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so what we developed for that, you would actually take for things like this, the roads where it's a little bit wider. And what we would be doing here is cutting on a low power setting, and we would unfocus the laser. So this is actually a little bit too low. And so instead of doing these roads by going like this, I mean, it would take 40 minutes to raster an entire thing. You put it on the cutting mode and it would go, and then you could raster your badges and things like that with information and the names, the logos for the roads. That sped it up a lot. You do your top layer and then you come down and you have to cut out your lower layers. So now we have all our sheets that are separate, but they're still white. You want them to be blue. So you can get pickled white and then they dump a whole bunch of blue pigment into it and stain all of them. Then you have to let them dry. I made some racks so that it could hold them to let the air circulate between. And then you would glue them all together. If you use an ink brayer, it's just a roller. You can roll your glue around much faster. Now, all your layers need to line up. You can't just stick them on there and hope for the best. So what we would do is use dowels, and you just drop those in there to help it get lined up. So it's registered off of all these holes on each layer. And then we would take and just pop some 18 gauges around the perimeter to hold everything in place, yank these out, so now we have a flush surface. And these would sit on top of a piece of granite. And then we would use cauls. We tried a whole bunch of things. I eventually used cauls, which are like this. They're bent up. You put them on here, clamp them down, it provides even pressure. Pull that out, do a final sand on here. You have to glue all your islands on by hand because you couldn't do that first time. On the back, we would etch a thing on there, a little bit hard to see on this one. Mount a key slot so that you can mount that on the wall. Then you take it out and you spray it. I was just using pre-cat lacquer. It worked pretty good, it dries quickly. It dries really quickly when it's warm outside. So quickly, in fact, that from one pass to the next, you get the dimpled look, it won't flow into each other. That was a little bit tricky on the hot days, but you get all that done, sand it just lightly, hit it again. and that's how you get your nice gloss finish. So that's the map itself, and then you need a frame for it. So we had 3 frames originally, eventually went basically to 1 or 2. This is maple. We had the maps in 2 sizes as well. That's the large size. These are small size frames. I don't have ones that correspond to each other. And so the frame I had all set up. I made these jigs for putting on pieces of raw lumber for the large and the small frames. So you could hook it as a hook on the end on your lumber, and you can see that you're going to get 2 large ones. You can see that you could get 2.5 of these, so obviously a board this wide would be better to use for large frames. You can even hook them like this and see if you can get maybe 2 larges and 2 smalls. In order to biscuit these together in the corner, you have to use little tiny biscuits. You only have this much room. So I made a jig for that too, which looked like this. The router would sit here with a fly cutting bit, and you'd slide the pieces in, and it would hit the stop right here. So we could do that pretty quickly. I had several other improvements I was thinking about. If you're going to do high volume maps, you could make a stencil for the stain and then spray it with a spray gun. There were a lot of other things on the business end which were similar, things that you were going to try. And I had an actual list of things, which was probably half dozen at least items long, of things to try. There were some of them like the price. I brought the price down a bit. I tried different pricing. I tried having option pricing for some of the different things. That didn't make any difference. We tried different areas. One of the important things in business is to get away from selling to people that you know. You got to get where you're selling to strangers. I tried selling to different areas. I picked a lake that I knew absolutely no one on, and I tried selling some there to get a true read on what sort of response we would get. I tried doing a mailing there also. This was another one of the things that I tried. Since mailings have a really low response rate, but you can target it so well with lakes because you can see exactly where the people live. So it seemed like it would probably help it out. So I sent a mailing down. Even getting that designed, I had a postcard. You try and work with the person who's the designer at the local newspaper place, and they're supposed to be a professional, but a professional means that you get paid to do something. It doesn't mean that you're good at it. So there were some things there. I mean, we come back with the draft, and it has this really egregious misspellings on the text, and you say, isn't this a mistake? What about that? And they go, oh, well, it's part of the design process. And you say, no, that's not part of the design process. I don't think you know what you're doing. So that was not a very good experience either. I finally just forced it through. I got the thing sent out. So that was another item checked off the list. Didn't work. We tried doing art fairs. They had a little art show in our area. We were sitting there for 2 days in the in the chair and a table with the maps set up. We had a nice stand that I made out of scrap walnut for the maps to sit on, and that didn't help. It didn't help enough. All of these things worked a little bit, but they didn't work enough to offset all the effort that was going in. We tried having them in local stores like the bookstore and then some other places. That didn't work well enough. I tried doing things online. I put a post on Reddit that did quite well. I ended up getting 75 emails the next day requesting maps, but a lot of people don't follow through. A lot of people are far away. Those were one-offs, so you got a lot of time. The thing that really would have made this worthwhile is if you get where you can start selling a lake multiple times. That would have been helpful. There was a couple in the area that I did sell, 7, 8, 10 of them, and I did all right on those. With almost all the things on my list crossed off, it wasn't going too well. It just, in general, with the business and also on some other things, at one point I was trying to do 2 projects at once. I was working on a shower rebuild for somebody, and so I would drive south and cut out maps at the first part of the day, and then the second part of the day I would go and work on the shower. I ended up one day, it was always late, but the one day I was there till 1:30 in the morning just trying to push through getting this thing tiled. Really not that much fun. I saw a friend that I hadn't seen for a while, and they asked me if I'd been sick, right? Things like that. It's just it's not good for you, it's not fun, and you're not getting anything out of it. So when you end up in those situations though, you're down there, I had like my one final thing on my list was buy my own laser. Okay? It's that final kick right before you bail, where you say, I'm gonna keep trying. And I found this laser. It's an import laser, but it was used and had some other things. It was in Washington, D.C. And so a friend of mine lives in Maryland, which is just north of D.C., and I stayed with him overnight. I drove my truck out there. I made a crate based on the dimensions of the laser here, packed it up, drove out there, bought the laser, drove all the way back to Michigan. And it was raining at one point, and I knew that the back of the crate, so this is the truck, okay, and the crate was in here, and I hadn't been able to seal it up very well, like this. And so it was raining, and I knew I was on the freeway that the rain would go like this. There's some turbulence here, but it would basically keep going like that. So I just kept driving through the rain, even though I was running out, to keep it from getting too wet in the back. There was some stuff back here also in the truck, and it worked pretty well. I drove through the rain for like an hour and a half, and it was only a little bit wet. So things like that. I get my laser back. The thing weighs 350 pounds, and we get out of the truck, get it in here. The garage is just full of stuff, and I eventually got it working a certain amount, but it just wasn't working that well. And I finally, one day, it was late. I think it was a Sunday, and you just realize this is it, right? I mean, I had an actual list of things to try. They're all crossed off. It's not working. What are you doing? I decided to call it, and it was fantastic. It's one of those moments where you make the decision, you say, you know what? I'm done. It's over. I'm gonna pack it in. Part of the reason this project continued so long was that I had some personal things at the time going on which weren't going that great. And it's a good distraction. When you have a project like this, you can just throw yourself into it. It's a 24 hours a day thing, all consuming. And it's not great, but I think it's a much better option than drinking heavily or any number of other destructive things that you can do to yourself or anything else. So that's how I dealt with it. I went crazy on making lake maps. But you get done with it, and even when you say to yourself, okay, now I'm done, you still have the sort of debris to clean up, right? I have a laser sitting here. What do I do with this? I don't want it anymore. You have materials sitting around. So the materials, I still have some of them. Some of them you can use for different things. I had boxes that I had bought. Having large, clean sheets of cardboard is actually really helpful for templates and quite a few other things. So that's slowly getting used up. Packing foam, plywood. You always find a use for plywood, making drawers or whatever. For the laser, I eventually sold the laser to a guy who actually lives in Chicago. The laser continued its progress westwards. I don't know where it is now, but I sold it to that guy, and it was really nice too because I was concerned that I was going to have this laser sitting there. Ultimately, I'm proud of the fact that I ran down the list. I didn't give up on any of the things. I had all the different possible ways it could succeed. I tried all of them 100%, really hammered on it, and it just didn't work. One of the biggest lessons from this, which I already knew from doing builder projects a bit, but it really drove it home. Interest does not equal sale. People will come up to you and they will tell you all day long how cool it is, how great it is, how creative, how much they love it. They love it that your local guy's doing this, and they won't buy it. Some of them will. Most of them won't. It's tricky. So much interest, not much sale. And I really thought that the whole emotional tie with the lake would help drive that so that it would look more like that, but it didn't. So interest not equal to sale. I think I made almost 50 different lakes, 40 or 50, and I'll put those on the site in an album. I'll have a link down below. I hope that was interesting hearing about this project. It's been instructive for other projects. I think it's come in useful. And it makes a good story, so who knows. Anyway, thank you for watching, and be back next week with a more regular building project.